65 men, one wooden ship, no doctor, no privacy, no escape. Yet somehow, packed shoulder to shoulder in freezing darkness, these Vikings ate, slept, and went to war on the open sea without collapsing into a floating plague. 65 men, one narrow hull of oak and iron, riding low on a grey-black sea. If you look at it from a distance, it appears like a splinter pressed into the surface of the water, too small and too fragile to hold that much life. Move closer, and it gets worse. There is nowhere private to stand, let alone lie down. Men are wedged between benches, gear and shields stacked around them, oars resting within easy reach. The sail hangs heavy, stained by salt and smoke. Everything is damp, everything is shared. By all logic, this is not a ship. It is a coffin that hasn't sunk yet. The North Sea does not forgive. Cold spray lashes the deck, soaking wool cloaks and leather boots until they cling like second skins. Every exhale hangs briefly in the air before the wind tears it away. The men eat here. They sleep here. They bleed here. They defecate a few steps away from where they pray and sharpen their blades. They row until their hands crack and callous. They cough into the same air, handle the same ropes, drink from barrels propped against the same ribs of timber. They live like this not for hours, but for weeks at a time. If you were designing the perfect incubator for disease, you would struggle to do better than a Viking longship. Crowded bodies jammed into a space barely wider than a modern hallway. Constant moisture, limited heat, no separate quarters for the sick, no isolation wards, no sealed latrines, no concept of germs. Here, a single infected gut should mean dysentery spreading along the benches within days. One contaminated barrel of water should quietly kill a third of the crew before they even see land again. A single louse carrying the wrong bacterium should be enough to turn this tight-knit band of raiders into a floating fever ward. You would expect the sagas to be filled with this, stories of ships that left harbour proud and strong, only to drift back weeks later, half their crew delirious, the rest dying in their own filth. Chronicles recording the year the Northmen's fleet rotted at sea, mass graves dug near beaches where raiders crawled off their vessels and collapsed. Instead, you find something else. Not silence, but an absence of the obvious catastrophe. These ships sail, they raid, they trade, they return. They do it again the next season, and again after that. They cross from Norway to the British Isles, from Denmark to Francia, from Iceland to Greenland and beyond, and they keep doing it for centuries. Contrast that with later ships, built with far more technology and much more space. Enclosed decks, designated sleeping quarters, dedicated heads for waste, naval surgeons with instruments and knowledge of anatomy, regulations about cleaning routines, and yet cholera rips through those crews. Typhus burns through cramped hammocks in the dark below decks. Scurvy turns gums black and bodies useless on voyages that were, on paper, better supplied and more civilized than anything a Viking chieftain could have imagined. In the age of sail, disease kills more men than enemy cannon fire. Ships that look safer on the plans become, in practice, mobile charnel houses. The Viking longship stands in blunt opposition to that logic. It is too open, too exposed, too raw. There is no warm, enclosed galley, no lower deck where men can retreat from the elements. The keel runs like a spine down the centre, ribs arch upward, planks overlap in a clinker pattern, and that is the whole world. Wind, rain, and cold are constant companions. The ship doesn't shelter the crew from the environment, it welds them to it. Comfort is not part of the design. Survival is, and survival here seems to defy the epidemiological math. Imagine you are one of these men, a farm owner, or a bondie who has left the safety of land for this pitched, restless platform. Your cloak is your blanket, your shield is your windbreak. Your neighbour, pressed so close that you feel his every shrug and shift, is also your first potential source of infection. You trade food with him, share stories with him, And if he starts to cough, you breathe in the same air that carries whatever is in his lungs. When the sea calms and you grab a few hours of sleep, it's in the same cramped space where you worked all day. No fresh linen, no change of clothes, just the same sweat, the same damp wool, the same grain of salt crystals scratching your skin. Now layer in the brutality of the schedule. Ore shifts that blur day and night, storms that force every man to the edges of what his body can endure, hunger gnawing at the edges of your focus, chronic fatigue. All of these weaken the immune system. All of them make the crew, theoretically, more vulnerable to any infection that makes it aboard. Yet this is precisely the lifestyle that supported the expansion of the Norse world. These ships did not only carry raiders, they carried settlers, traders, women, children, livestock. They ferried the living infrastructure of new societies to Icelandic valleys and Greenlandic fjords. From a distance of 1,000 years, it looks impossible. A long, narrow box full of human beings, shielded by nothing but planks and their own habits, bounced across rough seas and expected to function as an assault platform at the end of the journey. It should have failed. It should have succumbed to the oldest enemies humans know: bad water, rotting food, uncontained waste, and parasites breeding in unwashed wool. But it didn't. Not enough to stop the raids, not enough to halt the migrations, not enough to write itself into the chronicles as a recurring disaster. This is where the mystery begins. Not with some mythic claim that Vikings were superhuman or magically resistant to illness, but with an uncomfortable question. What were they doing, consciously or not, that turned a coffin-shaped ship into a survivable habitat? The answer isn't a single clever invention hidden below deck, because there is no below deck. It is not a secret latrine, a special medicine, or a lost technology. It lies in the way they ate, the way they slept, and the way they fought, and how all three were forced into patterns by the Longship's uncompromising design. Take away the romance, the horned helmets that never existed, the saga poetry. What remains is this: a narrow, overloaded hull that should have been a perfect trap for disease somehow became the backbone of an expanding maritime culture. Other navies, centuries later, with better tools and more scientific knowledge, lost more men to invisible killers than to steel. The Vikings, with none of that, still stood on foreign shores ready to fight. Their floating coffins did not become mass graves. To understand why, you have to go back onto that deck, between those benches and barrels, and watch what they actually did there, meal by meal, sleep by sleep, battle by battle. Stand at the water's edge and watch it approach. At first it's just a dark line against the grey swell, a low shadow cutting through white-capped waves. Then the shape resolves, a long narrow hull, higher at the prow and stern, curving like an animal's spine, arched to strike. The dragon head, if this chieftain has chosen to mount one, rises just enough to intimidate, not enough to catch too much wind. Cloth bellies with the gusts, the square sail mottled and patched from hard use. Beneath it, a row of shields hangs along the gunwale like a band of staring eyes. As the ship draws closer, you see the men. They are not packed below, hidden inside. They are there, on the open deck, in full view of the sea that can kill them. Step aboard, and suddenly the scale becomes painfully clear. A typical longship might be 20 to 30 metres from stem to stern, but only 2 to 3 metres wide at its fullest. Take a few normal strides and you've crossed from one side to the other. The keel runs down the centre, a straight line of authority. From it, ribs curve up and out, the bones of a creature built not for comfort but for speed. The planks along the sides overlap each other like stacked scales, clinker-built, held fast with iron rivets. Between those planks, tiny gaps breathe seawater in and out like lungs. Down the middle of this narrow world run the rowing benches. They are not cushioned. They are not evenly spaced for comfort. They sit where the structural logic of the ship demands, where the ribs can support them, where the oar ports can cut through the hull. Two men share a bench, backs slightly hunched, legs braced. Their oars reach out through narrow openings in the hull, blades biting into the sea. When the sail is up and the wind is kind, the oars rest along the thwarts, but the benches remain the defining furniture of this space. They are seats, tables, sleeping platforms, and storage racks all at once. There is no downstairs to escape to, no lower deck where officers can dine and sailors can sleep. Look beneath your boots, and you'll see the curve of the hull meeting itself. Between the keel and the benches, there might be a few loose planks you can lift to access small storage compartments, but these are shallow, cramped voids, not rooms. The Longship is a single, open chamber, exposed from rail to rail, from prow to stern. Everyone lives in the same long breath of cold air. Food is stowed where space allows. Barrels of weak beer or sour milk are lashed to the ribs, tied down so they don't become deadly projectiles in heavy seas. Sacks of dried fish and hard bread are wedged under benches, tucked into corners where feet won't grind them into crumbs. Anything that can rot quickly is either eaten early in the voyage or left behind. Weapons too must coexist in this cramped geometry. Spears and axes rest against the gunwale or lie along the deck near their owners. Swords hang at belts. Shields line the sides of the ship when not strapped to arms, doubling as a thin layer of extra planking against waves and arrows alike. The Longship's shallow draft is its greatest advantage and its silent tyrant. It needs only about a metre of water to float. That means it can slide up rivers, skirt shoals, and beach on almost any promising shore. But it also means it rides high on the surface. Like a leaf, it does not plough through waves so much as climb them, crest them, and then slap down the other side. The low freeboard, the short distance between the waterline and the top of the hull, brings the sea up close. Reach out from a bench and you can touch the water. Relieve yourself over the side and your waist is gone in seconds. But that same intimacy means icy spray is a constant presence, soaking clothing, supplies and skin. Without a deeper hull, there is no enclosed space to convert into cabins, no hold to turn into a galley. An open deck means there is nowhere safe to spark and tend a fire large enough for cooking while at sea. A stray ember could leap from a brazier into a coil of rope, a tarred seam, a fur cloak, and within minutes, the entire craft, a floating bundle of dried wood and fabric, would be an inferno. So the fire stays on land whenever they can reach it. The ship, by its very anatomy, bans the comforts that would be taken for granted centuries later. A kitchen, a mess hall, a heated sleeping room. Men eat cold food or food cooked earlier. They sleep in their cloaks, bodies curled around their weapons. Every plank and nail pins them into a pattern of behaviour. Oars need clear swinging space, so you cannot clutter the deck with chests and trunks. That forces equipment to be minimal, carefully chosen, and relentlessly organised. The leaking hull demands constant bailing, so someone is always hunched near the keel with a wooden scoop in hand, throwing bilge water back into the sea. The low freeboard makes vomiting, defecating and rinsing pots over the side easy. But it also means you must always maintain your balance, gripping a rope or bench, because one misstep could send you into the freezing water. The ship limits how filthy it can become, but it does so by offering no refuge. Eat where you sit, sleep where you worked, wash in the same cold air that slices through your cloak. There's no hiding your habits from the man next to you. If you let your gear rot, it infects his space too. If you fail to secure your barrel, it might crush someone when the waves rise. If you neglect to hang your shield or stow your spear, it tangles the oars and slows the ship, putting everyone at risk. The architecture enforces discipline long before any chieftain's orders do. It is prison and lifeline at once. You cannot get away from the other men, their smells, their noises, their moods. You cannot step away from duty. The oar you do not pull is an oar someone else must pull for longer. But the same narrowness that traps you also keeps death at bay in subtle ways. The open deck never lets air stagnate. The lack of hidden corners prevents filth from piling up unseen. The shallow hull forces frequent landings that break the monotony and reset the worst accumulations of waste and fatigue. The Longship does not care about comfort, it cares about movement. and by forcing its crew into habits tuned to its shape, it quietly becomes something more than wood and iron, a strict, unyielding system for keeping them just healthy enough to keep going. The first question is not about glory or gold or even survival. It is brutally simple. What do you put into the mouths of 60 hungry men when your entire world is a strip of planks 2 steps wide? Picture the ship 3 days into a voyage. The first thrill of departure has worn off. The coastline is a distant memory behind them, the destination still a rumour ahead. The men are not yet exhausted, but the novelty of the sea has already turned to routine. Oars creak, the sail snaps, stomachs growl, someone calls for food. There is no cook waiting beside a warm hearth, no galley tucked below deck, no stew simmering in a pot. Instead, a chest is dragged out from beneath a bench, a barrel is unlashed from the ribs, a leather bag, stiff with salt, is heaved into the open. What emerges is not appetizing in the way a modern plate is. There are no colours, no fresh greens, no soft steaming breads. Viking food at sea is beige, grey, hard and stubbornly dry. Start with the fish, not the silver glistening kind you might imagine hauled freshly from the sea and slapped on a fire. Those belong to days in harbour or nights camped on a beach. At sea, the fish is already dead twice over, once when it left the water, and again when it left moisture behind. Dried cod, stockfish, is as rigid as a board. You cannot bite through it immediately. You have to soak it, beat it, soften it. Men snap pieces off like kindling and chew until their jaws ache. The taste is pure concentration. Salt, oil, and the ghost of the ocean it once swam in. Then there is the bread, if you can call it that. Not fluffy loaves, but flat, hard discs. Barley or rye kneaded into toughness, baked until most of the water has fled. These rounds can last weeks without moulding, but they will fight you for every bite. Teeth crack, gums bleed, crumbs scatter into the seams of cloaks and beards. They are more like edible tiles than anything resembling comfort food. Yet they do their job. Bulk in the stomach, slow-burning fuel for tired muscles. Cured meat adds a precious hit of fat and protein. Strips of pork or mutton, salted and air-dried, hang from hooks in the rafters of a longhouse before ever seeing a ship. On board, they emerge slick with preserved fat, sometimes tinged with the faint sourness of age. Cut with a knife and shared along the bench, they are both nourishment and morale. A mouthful of salted meat can pull a man's mind back to home, to smoke-blackened rafters, to winter feasts. It reminds him that this misery has a purpose. To wash it all down, there is almost never plain water. Not because the Vikings didn't understand its importance, but because they understood, in a rough, unschooled way, its treachery. Fresh water in wooden barrels turns on you. It takes on the flavour of the wood, then the taste of whatever invisible life is breeding inside it. Stagnant, sour, it becomes a gamble with every swallow. So instead they carry weak beer and sour milk. The beer is not the heavy, celebratory drink of a feasting hall. It is thin, low in alcohol, closer to flavoured water than celebration. But the grain that fed it and the boiling that birthed it did something vital. It killed what would make a man sick. Every barrel of ale is an accidental, laboratory experiment in pasteurization. The Vikings don't know the word, but they know this. Beer lasts longer than plain water, and it doesn't betray them as quickly. Sour milk does its own quiet work. Lactic fermentation, again untheorized but carefully observed, keeps it from rotting outright. Its tang speaks of survival, not spoilage. Notice what is missing. No baskets of fresh fruit, no leafy greens, no soft cheeses that melt at a touch. Anything that rots quickly, stays ashore, or gets eaten in the first days before the ship commits to deep water. This is partly practicality. Space is limited, weight is precious, and every extra item must justify its existence. But in stripping the diet down to its dried, salted, fermented core, they accidentally step around many of the traps that later sailors would fall into. There is very little here for the microbes of rapid decay to feast on. No tubs of stew left to cool and sour in a warm galley. No heaps of vegetable peels moulding in hidden corners. No fruit, bruised and leaking sugar-rich juice into the cracks of a wooden deck. What little organic waste is created in the food process is either minimal or easily tossed overboard. The diet is monotonous, heavy, and often unpleasant but unforgiving to the organisms that cause foodborne illness. This is not health as modern nutrition would define it. There are consequences. Months of this kind of eating will leave bodies craving freshness, vitamins silently depleted, gums softening towards scurvy long before anyone has a name for it. But for the short, violent arcs of most Viking voyages, a few weeks out, a few weeks back, the system works. The men stay strong enough to row. Their guts, while never truly comfortable, are not collapsing from waves of vomiting and diarrhea. The food fills them without frequently poisoning them. On this narrow ship, every choice has to earn its place. A barrel of weak beer instead of water, a bag of dried fish instead of a basket of fresh ones, a stack of hard bread instead of something softer and more perishable. These decisions are not made out of scientific knowledge, but out of hard, repeated experience. Somewhere in the unwritten memory of their culture, enough men have watched enough food turn deadly to shape these habits. So when a break comes, when the oars still and the sail slackens and the call for food goes out, what emerges from the shadows under the benches is not a feast. It is a survival kit. Every bite is a compromise between taste and time, comfort and shelf life. In that compromise lies one of the simplest, most effective protections they have against sickness. The Vikings do not eat to feel good. They eat to keep moving. And in designing a diet that can endure the edge of the world, they unwittingly starve many of the enemies they cannot see. Fire is a strange kind of god on a wooden ship. On land, it is the heart of the home, the centre of the longhouse, the glow that turns raw meat into food and cold rooms into shelter. At sea, in a longship smeared with tar and stitched together from planks dry enough to float, fire becomes something else. It is less a tool and more a predator that must never be allowed on board. Look closely at the vessel you've already stepped onto in your mind. The hull is oak, the ribs are oak, the benches, the mast, the yard that holds the sail, all wood. The seams between the planks are sealed with animal hair and tar. The sail is wool, dried and stiffened with endless exposure to sun and salt. Ropes coil in piles, greased with tallow. Shields hang along the sides, many faced with leather. Every part of this machine, except the iron nails and rivets, is fuel. One stray coal, one overturned brazier, one poorly shielded ember, and you would have a fire that feeds on everything the crew needs to stay alive. That is why there is no galley, no stove bolted to the deck, no stone hearth carefully built into a corner. The Longship's open deck leaves nowhere to safely contain flame that can reach high and wander. You could try to set a small fire in a clay or metal vessel, but the first rough wave might send a curtain of sparks over cloaks and rope. A sudden gust could flip the whole thing, spilling coals into the bilge where wood meets tar in a tight, air-fed cradle. In a storm, such a mistake would not just risk a single life, it would doom the entire crew. So the Vikings make a brutal calculation. The warmth and comfort of fresh, hot food must be sacrificed to protect the ship itself. Fire belongs on land, water belongs under the ship. They do not mix the two. If you want to see what cooking really looks like for these men, you have to follow them when the keel meets sand. The ship is beached on a gently sloping shore, the bow pushed up above the tide line, with straining shoulders and shouted commands. Only then does the world change. Instead of a fragile strip of planks, there is solid ground underfoot. Instead of an endless moving horizon, there are trees, rocks, perhaps a low rise they can use as shelter from the wind. And in the centre of that temporary world, they build what the Longship refuses to allow them. A fire. The beach camp is ugly and efficient. Driftwood, scrub branches, anything dry enough to burn is hauled into a pile. Someone who knows what he's doing chooses a spot where sparks won't easily jump into nearby brush and where the smoke can blow away from the resting men. Soon there is a blaze, then a bed of coals, then stones warming at the edge. Pots are slung, spits erected, meat sizzling as fat drips down and pops in the embers. Dried fish can be softened, stews can be brewed from whatever they carried and whatever they can find nearby. Here, food is cooked not for that moment alone, but for the days that follow. Meat is boiled and then dried again, stewed and then cooled, fat preserved as tallow. Bread is baked or reheated. Fish is smoked harder, packed away with care. What they can eat hot, they devour in that window of safety. Sitting on rocks, laughing more freely, hands finally warmed by something other than their own effort. What they cannot eat now is transformed into cargo, not just provisions, but time made solid. They are, without thinking in those terms, turning heat into shelf life. Those barrels and sacks and leather bags go back aboard once the fire burns low and the tide shifts. The ship becomes itself again, a fireless world. Every piece of food now carries the memory of flame, not its presence. They ration it with the same discipline they apply to their weapons and oars. A portion for today's rowing, a portion for tomorrow's. A sliver of meat, a chunk of hard bread, a cup of sour milk or weak beer. The system has to be strict. Overeat after a successful raid or an easy day, and you may find yourself hungry when the sea turns against you and land is far away. What this creates is a new problem, the cold meal. Most of what passes a Viking's lips at sea has cooled hours or even days ago. Fat congeals into waxen layers, bread stiffens further, dried fish never really softens unless it's been soaked. Eating becomes work, not pleasure. On a raw, damp morning with fingers numb and joints aching, lifting lukewarm meat to your mouth instead of a steaming bowl weighs on the mind as much as on the stomach. Morale takes hits in small, relentless bites. There is no smell of roasting to lift spirits while waves crash against the hull. No shared warmth from a communal fire while men lean in and talk. Instead, there is chewing in the wind, swallowing against a throat already dry from salt air. The body too pays a price. Cold, dense food sits heavily in a gut that has been rocked back and forth for hours. Digestion slows, cramps gnaw. The temptation is to eat quickly and get it over with. But your stomach is not fooled, it complains anyway. Yet this misery hides a harsh advantage, because no cooking happens on the ship, no pots are left half cleaned in corners, no scraps of food cling to the insides of a galley that never cools properly. There is no warm, greasy film coating the walls of a cooking area where bacteria can bloom. No dripping animal fat sinks into floorboards that will sit for days without thorough scrubbing. The Longship stays, biologically speaking, cleaner than it has any right to be for a vessel full of men. Cooking on land and eating at sea breaks the chain of contamination in a way no Viking could have explained, but many of them lived long enough to prove. When food preparation happens on soil, the waste stays there. Bones tossed into the bushes, spilled stew soaking into sand, grease burned off or absorbed into dirt. These do not follow them back onto the hull. On the ship, only the final product remains, stripped of most of its moisture, stripped of the environments in which dangerous microbes thrive. Other navies, centuries later, will build proud galleys into their ships, complete with iron stoves and chimneys. They will serve hot meals in the bowels of their vessels, and with them, invisible risks. A longship, by refusing to let fire aboard, never becomes a floating kitchen. It remains a floating box of bodies with less opportunity for foodborne infections to take hold. So the Vikings accept the trade. They know the comfort of a warm meal on a cold day as intimately as anyone, maybe more so. But they also know the cost of bringing fire into a world made entirely of fuel, and so they carry the memory of heat in their provisions instead of the flames themselves. The beach is where they feel human. The ship is where they must think like survivors. In that separation, fire on land, food at sea, lies one more quiet reason Their cramped, exposed war machines could cross the edge of the known world without becoming drifting tombs. Night on a longship is not darkness and silence. It is a different kind of battle. The sea does not sleep. It only changes mood. The wind slackens or shifts. The waves lengthen or sharpen, but they never truly stop. The ship rides all of it, climbing, falling, tilting just enough to keep muscles tense, even when men are desperate to relax. The crew has been rowing or bracing or hauling ropes for hours. Salt stiffens their beards, burns their eyes. Their hands sting with fresh blisters, layered over old calluses. Every bone hums with fatigue. Now imagine trying to sleep in a space only a few paces wide, with nothing between you and the open air but wool and willpower. There are no bunks, no hammocks strung from beams, no lined-up pallets with individual blankets. The architecture of the Longship does not allow it. The benches that carried them through the day, worn smooth by bodies and oars, become the only furniture available at night. Some men lie along them, backs pressed against the hard wood, knees drawn up to make room for the man at their feet. Others curl under the benches, in the narrow triangles of space between the supports and the curve of the hull, fitting themselves into the geometry like cargo. You sleep where you fit. More importantly, you sleep where you are allowed. The ship is never entirely at rest. Even in calm waters, someone must be on watch, eyes scanning the horizon, listening for the change in the wind that means a storm, watching for the dark blot of a coastline or a hostile sail. When rowing is required through the night, the rhythm becomes a brutal rotation. One group pulls the oars while another collapses beside or beneath them, trying to sink into something like rest while the whole vessel shakes to the beat of the stroke. There is no such thing as personal space. You roll over and your elbow meets someone's ribs. You shift your leg and find a boot or a shield boss or the hard corner of a chest. Weapons stay close. No one is foolish enough to leave a sword or axe far from reach, even in sleep. So you share your bed with your gear, the haft of your spear along your side, the wooden rim of your shield cutting into your shoulder, the weight of your sword belt pressed against your hip. Comfort is not even on the list of priorities. The first requirement is that you can wake and move in an instant if the shout comes. Clothing becomes bedding. Your wool cloak is no longer just a garment. It is your mattress, your blanket, your roof. You wrap it tightly around yourself, trapping what little warmth your body still generates. If you are lucky, you have a fur as well, something thick and musky that keeps the wind from knifing straight through you. The hull offers almost no insulation, just a thin barrier between your body and the cold breath of the sea. Men learn to use their shields not just as tools of war, but as makeshift walls. Propped along the gunwale or set upright on the deck, a row of shields can break the worst of the wind, creating tiny pockets of slightly less brutal air where a man can tuck his head and pretend, briefly, that he is not lying on a damp plank in the middle of a hostile ocean. Sleep comes in fragments, a few minutes with eyes closed, while the ship rides gently. Half an hour when the wind is steady and the oars are shipped. Maybe, on a merciful night, an hour or two in a row before the world demands your body again. No one expects 8 uninterrupted hours. That idea belongs to warm houses and locked doors. On a longship, rest is stolen, not given, and yet there is an odd, hidden mercy in this arrangement. The very things that make sleep miserable, the open air, the constant breeze, the absence of enclosed cabins, also keep something else at bay. On later ships with lower ceilings and tighter quarters below deck, men will sleep packed together in air that grows steadily warmer and wetter with every exhaled breath. Their lungs will fill with the same recycled moisture, carrying coughs and infections, from hammock to hammock. One man's fever will radiate through the darkness, turning the whole lower deck into a slow-moving petri dish. The Viking longship never lets the air stagnate. The wind that steals warmth also steals moisture. Every breath is carried away, just as it leaves the lips. Every cough disperses into the open, instead of lingering above a row of beds. There are no dark, unventilated corners where damp hangs heavy for days. Cold doesn't just bite the skin, it also strips away the conditions that let respiratory diseases flourish. It's a cruel trade, constant chill in exchange for a lower chance of suffocating in your crewmate's germs. Of course, this is not a conscious medical strategy. No Viking carpenter sat with a plan and thought, if I eliminate the cabin, I will reduce pneumonia. But the ship's design, born from the need for speed and shallow draft and flexibility, forces a way of sleeping that inadvertently protects the crew. Exposure is a curse and a shield at the same time. Psychologically, the men adapt to a world where sleep is always within reach of danger. You do not lie down and surrender to oblivion. You hover near it. One ear remains tuned to the creak of the mast, the tone of the helmsman's voice, the pattern of the waves. Your body learns to rest in segments, like a manuscript broken into short lines, each one ready to be interrupted. You learn to find a kind of peace in proximity to risk, to accept that the axe is always an arm's length away, and so is the man who might need you awake in an instant. Over time, this fractured sleep becomes normal. The mind stops longing for a wide bed and a sealed room every moment of the night. It still remembers them, in the hidden corners where homesickness lives, but it makes do with what it has. A patch of plank, a shared cloak, the solid familiarity of a comrade's shoulder pressed against your back. The ship offers nothing more. Yet for most of these men, it is enough. Not enough to be comfortable. Enough to wake up, alive, when dawn turns the edge of the world from black to iron grey, and enough to row again. By the time a Viking longship appears off your coast, the men on board are not tourists on an adventure. They are a loaded weapon, already cocked. The ship is their scabbard, and the moment its keel grinds against sand or shingle, the blade comes out. You can see that in how the vessel is arranged long before any sword leaves its sheath. Weapons are not stowed in neat chests, buried beneath gear, to be unpacked when convenient. They live in arm's reach. Spears and axes lean along the gunwales, spear tips, wrapped in leather or cloth to keep them from scraping and rusting. Halves polished by hands that know exactly where to grab. Shields line the sides of the ship like scales, their bosses glinting in the light. Pull one free, and it is already oriented for use. Swords hang at hips, even when men are rowing. The belt's adjusted so steel doesn't foul the oar, but never so far away that a man cannot reach for it in a heartbeat. Everything has a place, and that place is chosen for speed. You do not want to be fumbling for a misplaced axe while the ship is still sliding into the shallows. You do not want to remember, too late, that your shield is tied down under a coil of rope because you were careless the previous night. The Longship's cramped geometry actually enforces this readiness. With so little room to begin with, every object that matters must be exactly where it belongs. Weapons are woven into the daily life of the deck, as present during meals and sleep as they are in battle. When the coastline they've been hunting finally appears, an abbey, a village, a trading post, a rival chieftain's hall, the tempo changes. The practice choreography takes over, something repeated so many times that it sinks past conscious thought. Orders don't need to be shouted at full volume. A few sharp commands, a gesture of the hand, and the crew moves as one. The sail comes down first, hauled in and secured so it doesn't catch awkward gusts near shore. Oars slide into the water, blades flashing in unison. This is where all those endless hours of rowing show their second purpose. Yes, they move the ship, but they also have turned these men into a single organism. They know each other's timing, how hard to pull, how to adjust for a swell without tearing the rhythm apart. That same collective muscle memory that keeps the oars in tune is what will keep the shield wall intact when they hit the beach. The hull grinds into the shallows. There is a brief, chaotic-seeming moment where everything happens at once, but it only looks chaotic to someone who doesn't know the pattern. The bow bites into sand or gravel. Men on the forward benches drop their oars and surge to their feet. Shields come off the rails with a clatter. Spears are snatched up. Those at the stern jump over the side into knee-deep water, pushing the ship higher, anchoring it in place for a precious few seconds. Others follow, boots splashing, breath already burning in their lungs. Within moments, the ship they slept on becomes an empty stage, most of its crew already forming a line on solid ground. Shields overlap, spear points bristle. The men who were just rowing in silence are now presenting a wall of wood, iron, and hard eyes to whatever stands in their way. This transition from cramped, swaying deck to organised battle line is the true measure of their training. It is not enough to be brave. You have to be fast, and you have to be coordinated, or you die in the surf before you even step clear of the water. All of that readiness comes at a cost that is both obvious and invisible. The obvious part is written into their bodies. Rowing, hauling, and bailing are not mild exercises. They are full-body labours that grind strength into muscles, the way waves carve coastlines. Backs thicken, shoulders knot, hands split, and heal and split again. Every day aboard the Longship is a training session you cannot skip. You are always either building strength or burning it. This constant exertion keeps hearts strong and lungs powerful, makes tendons and ligaments hard to tear. In a fight, a man used to dragging a heavy oar against a stubborn sea will have reserves that a farmer or sedentary priest simply does not possess. But the same exertion drags them toward the edge of collapse. There is never quite enough sleep. There is rarely enough food to feel more than not hungry for now. Muscles that seem carved from oak are also constantly flirting with exhaustion. In that state, the body is more vulnerable to certain kinds of illness. Wounds heal slower when you are depleted. A minor cut from a rough blade, a broken nail torn back to the quick, an oar splinter buried in the palm. These are small openings where infection can creep in. Combat magnifies that risk. Vikings do not fight with clean, precise weapons in sterile conditions. They clash in mud, sand, spray, and blood. Blades bite, axes crush, splinters fly from shattered shields. A gash that seems stable after a raid can fester quietly days later. There is no onboard infirmary, no surgeon with disinfectants and sutures. They rinse wounds with whatever they have, sometimes clean water from a stream if they are lucky, more often seawater or ale. They bandage with wool or linen, perhaps steeped in herbs, if someone has the knowledge and supplies. Infection is a constant shadow at the edge of every victory. Managing those injuries becomes an improvised medicine, shaped by tradition and necessity. A deep, foul-smelling wound might be cauterized with a heated blade at the next shore camp. Pus is squeezed out with rough fingers. Bandages are changed when they become visibly filthy or when the pain becomes too much to ignore. A man who cannot keep up, who can no longer row or stand in the shield wall, is a burden in a space that cannot afford many. Harsh decisions follow from that simple reality. But as brutal as this care is, the crew is still doing something vitally important. They are paying attention. Ignoring wounds kills more men than treating them badly. Under all of this, training, exertion, improvised treatment, runs one more invisible safeguard: discipline. Panic spreads faster than any disease. On a ship, it is lethal. One man losing his nerve at the wrong moment can cause a chain reaction. Oars out of sync, landing routines faltering, men hesitating between staying with the ship and charging the shore. That hesitation creates confusion, and confusion is when people forget to guard their backs, lose track of their gear, fail to notice the injured until it's too late. The Vikings counter that with drilled routine that reaches into every corner of life on board, where weapons are stored, how shields are taken down, which side of the ship certain men debark from, who leads the line, who anchors the flank, who stays back to guard the vessel. When everyone knows their role, the mental load during crisis drops. Fewer mistakes means fewer unnecessary injuries, fewer bodies trampled in the rush, fewer chances for chaos to degrade into lethal disorder. In this way, fighting from a moving floor is not just about strength or fearlessness. It is about systems embedded in bone-deep habits, where your sword hangs even while you sleep, how your hands find your shield in the dark, how your feet know what to do the moment they feel sand under them instead of planks. The Longship is not just carrying warriors, it is shaping them, forcing them to become a strike team that can shift from rowing to war in the space of a breath, and then, if they live, back again. That cycle, repeated over and over, keeps them sharp enough to win and organised enough to survive what winning always brings with it: blood, pain, and the quiet war against infection that begins after the shouting stops. There is a reason the sagas talk about blood and steel and glory, but almost never about what it actually smelled like on a longship. Imagine you are sitting at your rowing bench, back aching, hands raw. The man in front of you is so close that his shoulder presses into your knee each time he shifts. The man behind you exhales, and you feel his breath on the back of your neck. Cloaks overlap, elbows collide. When you try to stretch your legs, you find someone's pack, someone's shield, someone's sleeping space. There is no such thing as your area. There is only the space your body currently occupies, and even that is on loan. You share everything in this press of flesh and wool. When you eat, someone's hand is inches from your mouth. When you sleep, your cheek might rest against another man's back. When you cough, there is no way to turn far enough aside that you are not breathing into someone's air. At night, if the wind slackens and the sea calms, a new stillness descends, one made of snores, muttered dreams, and the soft, rhythmic rasp of men scratching themselves raw beneath layers of fabric. Because inside those cloaks and tunics, life is crawling. Wool is warm, durable, and essential in the northern cold. It is also heaven for lice and fleas. They move through seams and folds, laying eggs in the hidden corners of clothing that almost never gets truly clean. You can wash your face in a splash of seawater, even rinse your hair, if you are brave enough to endure the cold. But soaking and scrubbing an entire outfit is harder, especially at sea. So the vermin ride with you, feeding on your blood, leaving inflamed bites that itch enough to drive you half mad in the long hours between tasks. Bedding is no refuge. Whatever you lie on, your cloak, a fur, a rolled-up garment, is the same fabric that has been pressed against your sweating body all day. Parasites do not care if you are sitting, standing, or trying to sleep. They only care that you are warm and alive. In this kind of close confinement, one lousy man is not just disgusting, he is a vector. There is always the potential for a single infestation to spread through the crew like fire, turning every rest period into a scratching, sleepless ordeal. The Vikings are not ignorant of this. They live close to their own filth in the most literal sense, and they know exactly what it does to them. That is why the war against dirt and vermin becomes as routine as rowing. It is not about vanity, it is survival. When the ship finally noses toward a shore, even a small stony one, the race for water is not just about drinking. Men strip down as far as the weather allows, wading into the surf or kneeling by a stream. They scoop handfuls of freezing seawater or fresh river water and begin to scrub. Sand becomes a kind of soap, scouring sweat and grime from skin. Hair is rinsed, pulled through fingers until tangles loosen and clumps of shed lice and eggs are flicked away into the current. Beards are washed, combed, trimmed. If there is time and shelter from the wind, tunics and cloaks may be dunked as well, then beaten against rocks or wrung out by hand. None of this makes them clean in any modern sense. But it resets the filth, it reduces the load. Every wash day at a landing erases a layer of sweat, salt and parasites that would otherwise keep accumulating with nowhere to go, but deeper into fibres and flesh. The tools they carry tell the same story. Those carved bone combs found in graves are not decorative trinkets. They are weapons in this daily grooming war. To comb your hair is to drag teeth through a population of unwelcome guests, catching them, crushing them, flinging them away. Men sit on a log or a rock bent over their knees, combing again and again until the scalp feels raw, but also lighter, less alive with crawling. Some will share washing bowls, passing them around in the order of rank or age, each man splashing his face and beard, clearing away the worst of the day's residue. And behind all of this is something less tangible, but no less powerful: shame. In a space this tight, your habits are everyone else's problem. If you smell worse than the rest of the crew, people notice. If you never wash your hands, never shake the lice out of your cloak, never take a turn at cleaning or bailing, it isn't a private failing, it's an insult. Mockery follows, the cutting kind that leaves marks deeper than any scratch. A man can endure physical hardship more easily than he can endure the slow erosion of his standing among his peers. Honour, on a longship, is not just about courage in battle. It's also about not being the one who makes life unbearable for everyone else. That social enforcement is a quiet but constant pressure. You do not skip grooming because the cost is not just lice, it's losing face. Even the toughest warrior does not want to be known as the one who reeks, the one whose gear crawls, the one whose presence makes the already oppressive air worse. In this way, hygiene becomes decentralized. There is no ship's officer ordering mandatory wash days. There is no medic inspecting hair and clothing. Instead, each man becomes his own small sanitation unit. He combs his hair, washes his hands, shakes out his bedding, not only for himself, but for the men pressed against him, day and night, and they do the same. The effect multiplies, rippling through the crew like a silent agreement. We are already living on top of each other. We will not make it worse than it has to be. Does it stop all disease? Of course not. Wounds still fester, intestinal parasites still lurk, but it slows the spread of the problems that thrive in filth. In the tight, unsparing ecosystem of a longship, that can be the difference between a crew that slowly degrades into misery and one that stays just healthy enough to keep rowing, keep fighting, keep pushing into the next stretch of cold, open water. There is a point on every long voyage where the body can still keep going, but something inside starts to fray. The cold is no longer surprising. It's just there, like a second skin. Your cloak has been wet so many times that you've forgotten what it feels like to be truly dry. Your fingers burn when you first grip the oar in the morning, then go numb, then throb back to life when you let go. Sleep comes in fragments that never quite add up to rest. You've stopped counting the days because the sea has no calendar, only grey. The real battle now is inside your skull. Cramped decks and constant danger do something to a mind that wasn't born on a ship. At first, the noise and closeness are almost exciting. You are surrounded by men you know, men you trust, or at least men whose reactions you can predict. There's camaraderie in the shared discomfort. But after enough days of the same faces, same smells, same view of the same strip of sea, the walls of the world feel like they are closing in, even though there are no walls at all. Every creak becomes a question. Was that just the mast shifting, or is something giving way? Every change in the wind is a threat. When a storm rolls in and the waves grow teeth, the sensation of being constantly on the edge of capsizing sinks deep into the nervous system. You begin to feel danger even when the sea calms again, as if your body has forgotten how to stand on something that isn't moving. Sleep does not erase that feeling. It gives it a new shape in dreams, where the ship finally does roll, and you wake with your heart hammering and your hands already reaching for a rope that isn't there. Left alone with this kind of pressure, a man's thoughts can turn inward and sour quickly. He starts to count aches, catalogue imagined illnesses, replay old fears. The cramped space offers nowhere to walk it off. You cannot stride out into a field and let the wind clear your head. You are stuck shoulder to shoulder, trapped not by walls but by necessity. You have to be here. If you break in front of everyone. The Vikings had no therapists, no manuals on coping with stress, no clinical language for anxiety or depression. What they did have were old tools, sharpened by constant use, stories, songs, boasts, and a particular kind of humour as black as the sea at midnight. When night falls and duties are as light as they will ever be, someone starts talking. It might be a tale of their own exploits, told with just enough exaggeration to draw laughs and groans. It might be a saga they all know, recited verse by verse, each man picking up the thread when the last one falters. They talk of heroes who faced worse odds, of ships that sailed through storm and battle and came back heavier with treasure than when they left. They mock old enemies, invent ridiculous insults, twist fear into something they can laugh at rather than drown in. Songs do their own work. A rowing chant sets a pace and unites muscles, but it also gives thoughts something to hook onto other than dread. Drinking songs might ring slightly hollow when the beer is weak and rationed, but the melodies carry memories of full feasting halls and roaring fires. Even dark humour has its place. When a wave soaks everyone to the bone, someone will make a joke about the gods wanting them clean for the slaughter. It's cruel, it's bleak, and it makes men snort laughter instead of staring too long into the thought. Underneath the jokes and stories is something harder and less flexible. The religious framework that shapes how these men understand suffering itself. They do not believe they are the central authors of their fate. The Norns, the weavers of destiny, have already tangled their lives into a web. Odin watches, other gods watch. The outcome is not fully in their hands. What is in their hands is how they meet it. Dying of sickness, rotting slowly in a bed, is seen as a lesser end. Dying in battle, weapon in hand, is something else entirely. It is a ticket, however mythic, to Valhalla or another honoured afterlife. This belief does something very practical aboard a longship. It reframes risk. Fear is still there. No one wants to feel cold water close over their head. But it is no longer meaningless. Holding the line in a storm, staying at your oar when your arms scream to stop, taking your place in the shield wall when the keel hits sand. All of this is not just survival. It is a performance being watched by gods as well as men. Group identity wraps around that belief like a second chord. The men on this ship do not think of themselves as random individuals who happen to share a ride. They are a band, a crew, in some cases sworn to a chieftain whose honour is intertwined with their own. In their minds, they are tougher than the farmers who stayed behind to till the soil, tougher than the merchants who hug the coast and sleep in sheltered harbours, tougher than other sailors, too soft or too fearful to ride a low, open ship across deep water. Pride is a shield, and it is frequently all they have. You do not admit you are terrified of the next storm. You do not complain that the cold is getting into your bones. You might joke about it, curse it, spit at it, but you do not confess to being broken by it. If you do, you risk stepping outside the circle of hard men who are supposed to be able to endure anything. Better to grit your teeth, to row a little harder, to boast louder than you feel. The performance becomes reality, more often than not. You act strong, and then you are. At least enough to keep going. This mindset doesn't stop illness. No amount of pride can keep a cut from festering or scurvy from loosening teeth. The gods do not reach down and pluck every arrow from the air. Men still die, sometimes miserably, sometimes pointlessly. But what this internal armour does is prevent collapse. The collective unravelling that turns a group of capable warriors into a quivering mass of fear and resignation. On a longship, the line between functioning and finished is thinner than the plank under your feet. Once enough men stop believing they can endure, the practical consequences follow fast. Missed strokes at the oars, sloppy landings, hesitation in battle, negligence in caring for wounds or cleaning gear. The ship's whole survival system relies on everyone doing their part, even when every instinct is screaming to lie down and give up. So the Vikings fight a two-front war, one against the elements, the sea, the enemies on shore, and one against themselves. Stories, songs, black humour, a worldview that insists suffering can be meaningful, and a group identity built on toughness. All of these work together to keep the mind from breaking before the body does. They cannot stop the North Sea from trying to kill them, but they can stop their own thoughts from doing the sea's work for it. If you want to understand how strange it is that Viking crews didn't constantly die in droves, you have to fast forward a few centuries and walk the decks of ships that, on paper, should have been far superior. Imagine stepping from a Viking longship onto a late medieval cog. Suddenly the world changes shape. The cog is fat where the longship is thin. It rides deeper in the water, with a broad full belly built to carry cargo. Above that swollen hull, wooden walls climb upward, forming a high-sided box, with a single mast stabbing into the sky. There is a real deck now, flat and continuous. Beneath it, enclosed spaces stretch from bow to stern. There are hatches, doors, ladders descending into darkness that feels almost luxurious after the ruthless openness of a longship. Further forward in time, and the ships grow more elaborate. Galleons rise like floating fortresses, stacked with multiple decks, cabins, galleries, gun ports bristling with cannon. Early modern naval vessels refine this design. 3 masts, square sails, hundreds of men assigned to specific hammocks, with separate quarters for officers, storerooms, and magazines. Somewhere below, a galley flickers. Iron stoves bolted to timber, smoke carried away by chimneys. There's a sick bay of sorts. There are established routines, discipline, enforced by written regulations rather than just custom. From one angle, these ships are triumphs of engineering. They can carry more food, more water, more weapons, more men. But there is a hidden cost in all that structure. Start below decks. The air is thick, warm and wet. Dozens, sometimes hundreds, of bodies lie in close rows, stacked on hammocks strung from beams. The ceiling hangs low enough that you have to hunch. Lanterns burn faintly, barely cutting through the gloom. Every breath, every cough, every whisper of fever stays in the same volume of air, hour after hour. The faint movement of air through hatches and gratings is never enough to truly flush it out. Here, water comes almost entirely from barrels. Huge, heavy casks strapped down in the hold, filled weeks or months ago in some distant port. At first, the contents are clear and cool, a welcome relief. But as time passes, the water grows stale. It picks up the taste of the wood, then something sourer beneath. Bacteria bloom in the dark. Men drink because they must, swallowing more than they know. One contaminated barrel can quietly seed illness through the entire crew. There is no infinite ocean flushing away what they discard. The ship is its own small, closed ecosystem. Now look at hygiene. A galley is a marvel, a place to boil and bake, to serve hot meals. But it also creates grease, smoke, and spatter. Food scraps fall between deck boards or cling to poorly cleaned pots. Fat splashes onto surfaces that no one has time to scrub properly. All of it becomes food for invisible life. The very thing that lifts morale, warm stew, fresh bread, can, under the wrong conditions, turn into a vector for disease. Ships like these often spend long periods anchored in ports, waiting for cargo, repairs or orders. During those stretches, waste disposal systems may lax. Latrines discharge near where ships take on water. Rats grow bold, fat on spilled grain and offal. The harbour itself becomes a reservoir of disease, and the ships bobbing within it act like sponges. Set that against the longship again. It looks primitive by comparison. No lower decks, no galley, no clean division between sleeping quarters and workspaces. Just one exposed plank world where everything happens in plain view. But precisely because it has none of these improvements, it dodges many of the traps that later ships fall into. There are no enclosed spaces where breath can stew into a warm fog of contagion. The wind is brutal, but it is also relentless. It whips away moisture, scatters droplets, makes it hard for airborne infections to linger. There are no massive freshwater barrels quietly rotting in the dark, because the ship could never spare the weight for them. Instead, there are smaller containers of weak beer and sour milk, liquids that have already been boiled or fermented into relative safety. There is no galley dripping grease into hidden corners, because fire is not allowed aboard in the first place. Even their movement patterns work in their favour. Longships are not built to sit idle in harbour for months. They are raiding and trading tools, in, out and gone. They beach instead of docking in crowded ports, sliding up onto lonely coves or riverbanks, where the main risks are weather and enemies, not sewage and rat colonies. They refill water from streams and springs as often as they can, not from harbours that collect the output of whole towns. Archaeological traces and written accounts hint at the difference this made. In digs at old harbours and towns, parasite eggs and signs of chronic intestinal disease show up heavily in dense medieval and early modern settlements, especially around ports. Skeletons of sailors from later eras sometimes carry the classic marks of scurvy and repeated infections. By contrast, when we look at Viking graves associated with ship burials and coastal settlements, we do see parasites and chronic problems, but not clear evidence of the catastrophic, voyage-ending epidemics that plagued later navies again and again. Contemporary chroniclers often describe Viking raiders as terrifyingly robust, big, strong, relentless. Some of that is exaggeration, enemy propaganda wrapped in awe. But some of it reflects a real contrast. When fleets met, it was often the Norse crews who seemed harder to break physically. They had their own long-term health problems, yes. Arthritis from years of labour, worn teeth from harsh diets, infections that no one could heal. Yet as a system, their way of travelling by sea was strangely resilient. The paradox is uncomfortable. The rougher, simpler ship, open, leaking, cold, turns out to be a better environment for avoiding certain diseases than the improved designs that followed. By sealing men away from the weather, later ships also sealed them in with their own waste, their own breath, and their own rotten water. By adding comforts, they created hidden spaces where contamination could accumulate. The Viking Longship, in its brutal honesty, never allowed that. It exposed everything: bodies, food, waste, fear to the open air, and the cleansing violence of the sea. It did not keep men warm or dry or well rested. It did not protect them from long-term damage. But it did something subtler and more important. It made it hard for sickness to get a foothold strong enough to topple the entire crew at once. From a distance of 1,000 years, it's easy to see the Longship as primitive next to the soaring silhouettes of galleons and warships. Up close, in the logic of survival, the picture flips. Technology, without understanding, can amplify risk. Simplicity, forced by necessity, can accidentally align with the realities of biology. The Vikings did not sail healthier seas. They simply sailed in a way that left fewer places for disease to hide. Stand on the deck again, before the story frayed into chapters and explanations. Just you, the ship, and the edge of dawn. The sky is the colour of old iron, somewhere between night and day. A thin line of light is rising behind low clouds, turning the tips of the waves from black to lead. The Longship rocks gently, anchored in a shallow inlet or riding easy swells offshore. You hear it before you see it fully wake. The creak of timber, the soft thump of a man shifting under his cloak, a cough dragged up from a chest that has known too much salt air. One by one, they emerge from the shapes they became. During the night, a man unfolds from under a bench, joints cracking. Another pushes himself up from a bench where he slept half-curled, cloak stuck to him in patches where sweat dried in the cold. They look rough, older than their years, eyes narrowed against the chill. But they are upright, they are breathing, they are not, as a matter of routine, dying. If you could freeze the scene here and peel back the layers, you would see the system that kept them alive, running in the background of every movement. Food first. Someone reaches for a chest, a barrel, a leather bag. What comes out is familiar. Dried fish, rock-hard bread, cured meat, sour milk or weak beer sloshing in a container. None of it was prepared here, on this deck. It was boiled, smoked, baked, fermented, long before. Fire has already done its work and vanished, leaving only food that can endure time and handling. There are no warm pots, no fresh stews. That absence of comfort is also the absence of a kitchen stuffed into a damp corner, dripping grease and harbouring rot. They chew silence into the same unappealing safe calories as always, and their guts, used to this punishment, take it without mass revolt. Look at where they slept. There are no cabins, no rooms where air went stale overnight. Just an open deck where the same wind that tore at their cloaks all evening has been pulling their breath out into the dark. They slept in shifts, some waking while others closed their eyes. Bodies curled around weapons and gear, stacked under benches, huddled behind shields, tilted against the wind. Every plank that dug into their ribs, every gust that stole what little warmth they had, also stole the chance for disease to simmer in still, damp air. Misery as ventilation. Fighting fits into this same brutal harmony. This ship is not built for siege warfare or months-long blockades. It is built to strike and vanish. Short, explosive violence at the moment of landing, a rush from oars to shore, a clash of shields, then either plunder and retreat or a swift, ugly death. The crew is not meant to linger in trenches or rot in camps where latrines overflow and bodies pile up. They are meant to go in hard, get what they came for, and leave before filth and exhaustion undo them. None of this was designed as a health strategy, the way we would use the term. There was no council of wise men drafting a sanitation protocol, no healer explaining germ theory to shipwrights. The system we see now was stitched together from necessity, habit, and cultural expectation. The Longship's architecture, open, shallow, unforgiving, set the boundaries. Within those boundaries, people did whatever kept them alive one more season. They ate what would not rot quickly, because rot was visible and disastrous. They slept where they fit, in the only space available, because there was no below deck to escape to. They accepted that fire and wood smeared with tar were mortal enemies, and so never tried to build a galley where one spark could ruin everything. They fought the way their ships demanded, fast, coordinated, in bursts of terrifying intensity that did not leave them rotting around city walls for months. Add to that the invisible threads, a culture that prized cleanliness more than many of their contemporaries, daily grooming baked into identity and honour, weekly washing woven into the very names of days, a worldview that turned suffering and risk into something with direction, toward glory, toward fate, toward an afterlife where dying with a weapon in your hand meant more than dying in a straw mattress, choking on your own mucus, a shared pride that refused to let men show weakness easily, forcing them to keep moving, keep rowing, keep watching, even when they were fraying at the edges. The cost of this system was everywhere, on their bodies. Parasites were not strangers. They were roommates. Teeth wore down early from harsh food. Old wounds ached constantly. Backs curved from years at the oar. Arthritis, chronic infections, and early death were normal. This was not a golden path to health. It was a way of holding the line. What never happened routinely, what never defined their seafaring, the way it later defined other navies, were the mass collapses that logic says should have come. No repeated stories of whole fleets turning into floating hospitals of cholera. No chronic pattern of ships limping home with half their crews rotted from the inside out by typhoid, contracted in stagnant water. They suffered, but they stayed operational. Expedition after expedition, crossing after crossing, their ships kept delivering crews who were battered but functional, capable of fighting at the end of the journey. Return now to that dawn. A man wipes salt from his eyes. Another buckles on his sword, the leather stiff, the metal cold to the touch. Someone adjusts the strap on a shield, making sure it will catch the first blow rather than fail at the worst moment. They eat, they stretch, they check the sky and the line of the shore. From a modern vantage point, knowing what we know about microbes and immunity, you might look at them and think, you should not be here. This environment should have broken you. This ship should have been your coffin. But it wasn't, because they did something that feels almost alien to us. They did not try to conquer discomfort. They did not try to seal themselves away from the world in an illusion of safety. Instead, they accepted the harshness and built their lives around it. They let the wind tear through their sleeping place so the air stayed clean. They surrendered the pleasure of hot meals in favour of food that wouldn't betray them later. They let the sea become their toilet, their trash heap, their cleaning agent. They used belief, pride, and habit to keep their minds from shattering before their bodies did. 5 centuries before other Europeans would drag heavier, more sophisticated ships across the Atlantic, these men stood on unknown shores, alive and armed, not because their bodies were stronger than ours in some mythic way, but because their entire system, from the curve of their hulls to the stories in their heads, was built to bend around danger instead of pretending it didn't exist. In a world like ours, obsessed with comfort and control, it's tempting to see progress only in thicker walls, softer beds, and more powerful medicine. The Vikings offer a darker, sharper lesson from the edge of the world. Sometimes survival doesn't come from adding more layers of protection. It comes from stripping them away, living face to face with the cold and the risk, and shaping your habits so that even when you are hungry, exhausted, and afraid, you are still ready to stand when the keel hits sand. Somewhere in the grey light between night and day, a longship cuts across the water and disappears into history. The men on board are gone, every ache in their shoulders, every scar on their hands, every cold night on open planks swallowed by time. What remains is the paradox they left behind. They lived and fought and sailed in conditions that should have broken them, and yet they didn't just survive. They expanded their world. They did it without doctors, without maps of bacteria, without steel hulls or engines or sealed cabins. They did it with leaking ships, fermented food, cold sleep, relentless work, stubborn faith, and a cultural instinct to bend around the dangers they could not see. The Longship was never comfortable. It was never safe, but it was honest. It forced them into habits that kept them just healthy enough, just disciplined enough, to stand on the shores of places they weren't supposed to reach. And now you're here, 1,000 years later, riding that same deck in your imagination. If you want to keep walking into these worlds, into Viking winters, longhouses, battlefields, and the quiet, brutal realities no saga bothers to glorify, don't let this be the last voyage we take together. Subscribe to Viking Times so you don't miss the next raid into the past. And before you go, drop a comment and tell me, where in the world are you watching from today?